it got to the point where I had pretty much convinced myself that I was the crazy one. And because I feared that I was the crazy one, that isolated me even more because I didn't know who would possibly be safe enough for me to talk to. So I didn't talk to anyone. And I don't know which was more devastating. The fact that I found out my husband was being unfaithful or the fact that I felt like I'd been made to feel crazy. I don't know which is more devastating. There's not even a word to describe the depth of that kind of pain.
The Exiles of Babylon Conference is happening again April 30th to May 2nd, 2026 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is going to be an amazing conference. Go over to theologyraw.com to check out all the details and register soon to take advantage of the early bird special, which ends, I believe, January 15th, I think. So theologyintheraw.com. My guests, plural, today are Lysa TerKeurst and Dr. Joel Muddamalle. Lysa is the president and chief visionary officer of Proverbs 31 Ministries and the author of eight New York Times best-selling books. That is absolutely insane, by the way. I don't know if you have a category for what it takes to be a New York Times best-selling author 8 times. That's insane. So, lots of fans out there, I'm sure. Her most recent book is Surviving an Unwanted Divorce, a biblical practical guide to letting go while holding yourself together, which she co-wrote with Jim Cress, a therapist, and Dr. Joel Muddamalle, who joins us on the show today. Joel holds a PhD in theology, serves as the director of theology and research at Proverbs 31 Ministries, and has written several books, including his forthcoming book, The Unseen Battle, which is insanely awesome. You got to check that out. He and Lysa co-host the Therapy and Theology podcast. This was a really great conversation, and this is an outstanding book, Surviving an Unwanted Divorce. I was just reading it this morning, and it's just, we talk a lot about it, but I just really appreciated how raw and honest and how biblical it is, which I know lots of books that are raw and honest. I know lots of books that are biblical. To combine those two categories is not always easy, and they do it extremely well. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Lysa TerKeurst and Joel Muddamalle. All right, Lysa, Joel, welcome to Theology Raw. I'm very excited about this conversation. First of all, let me hold up the book you guys wrote with Jim Cress, Surviving an Unwanted Divorce. I just want to thank you both, and I guess especially Lysa for writing this book. And I say especially Lysa because you are so vulnerable and raw and honest in the book. And your divorce was not that long ago. And the way you describe being up that night and just coming to the realization that this is something that you need to do. And I just felt like I was living your story with you. So yeah, thank you for the book. I think it's going to really bless and challenge and comfort so many people. Lysa, let me start with you. What led you to want to write this? It was one thing to go through this, but to write a book about it, like that's taken it to a whole new level.
Yeah, well, I did not want to write a book about this. I did not want this to be my story. I certainly do not want to be the poster child for divorce. And I definitely don't want it to seem as if I'm pro-divorce and not pro-marriage. I am very pro-marriage. I'm very pro-healthy marriage. I'm very pro the marriage that, yes, you're going to have some difficulties because all marriages have difficulties. But, I really believe in fighting through those difficulties to, get to a healthier place in your marriage and all of that. That's the story I wanted. Unfortunately, that's not how my story went because there's a big difference between a difficult marriage and a destructive marriage. My friend Leslie Bernick helped me see that. And when you're in a destructive marriage, there are dysfunctional patterns of, different kinds of decisions that the spouse who is creating the confusion and the chaos and the destruction, there's abuse, there's addictions, there's so many things that play into this that cross that line over into destruction. And I was very resistant to believing that. I just kept thinking, one more conference, one more counseling session, one more treatment program, one more year of staying, one more time of forgiveness, one more reconciliation, and things are going to turn around. So yes, the last 10 years of my marriage, I was separated off and on 5 of those years.
Oh, wow.
And so, my journey was much longer than what people probably even realize. So by the time that I finally got to the place where I accepted a very painful reality and walked through the death of my marriage, it had been years in the making, years of heartbreak. And so, the moment you referred to in the book where I'm staring out the window
Mhm.
and I'm equally terrified of the future and yet equally resolved that I knew this is the direction that I needed to go. I felt at that point I did not have another option to try to save the marriage. And yet the one person I wanted to call the most was, the man that I'd been married to for 30 years. So, it's this extreme harshness when there's a severing of a relationship that you thought would be for a lifetime. And yeah, so that's where I was. So
Mhm.
yeah, I never wanted to write this book because this isn't the story I wanted to
Right.
live. And yet, because it's the story that I've lived, and because I see so many people desperate for the exact kind of wisdom and therapeutic toolkit and
Mhm.
the theology underpinnings, I have access to all of that, and I just could not keep it to myself. I knew I
Mhm.
not only needed to help people surviving an unwanted divorce, but I also needed to help lay leaders and pastors and counselors have the theological understanding of what the Bible actually does and does not say about divorce. And certainly that's where Dr. Joel Muddamalle comes in.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to get to the theology in a bit. I've got several questions, and and as I said offline, Joel, I mean, you did a remarkable job handling a very difficult theological topic, um, in such an accessible way. I mean, big books have been written on this, lots of debates have erupted, and you did it in such a well written, easy to understand way without losing the depth.
Yeah.
Lysa, when you what can you take us back to that time when you first started to get suspicions of infidelity? I mean, you talk in your and other destructive things. You talk about kind of almost like pretending like it wasn't happening or making excuses for yourself. It took you a long time to really come to the realization like this is happening. When did you first start to get glimpses of that, and what did that feel like?
Yeah, well, at first there was a lot of confusion because, I very much deeply respected my then husband, and I had trusted him like
Mm,
for as many years as we've been married. I mean, there was a lot of trust there. And so, I couldn't even let my brain go. Even when I would see that things were off, I couldn't let my brain go to suspicion
mm,
because I would quickly override it by the reality of who I thought he was and who everyone else saw him as. And so, I
mm,
started to feel like maybe I was crazy because I
yeah.
would see things and then I would ask about it. And then, I was told, that's not what you saw. That's not what you
Mm,
heard. That's not what you experienced. And when there's this pattern of this, I think it got to the point where I had pretty much convinced myself that I was the crazy one. And
mm,
because I feared that I was the crazy one, then that isolated me even more because I didn't know who would possibly be safe enough for me to talk to. So I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't tell
okay.
anyone what I was going through for
Mm,
years.
wow.
And yet the weekend of my oldest daughter's wedding in early 2016 is when I found a burner phone. And at
Mm,
that point, I could no longer deny that things were things were not as they seemed. And I realized at that point that those suspicions I had were legitimate and that I was not crazy. And I don't know which was more devastating. The fact that I found out my husband was being unfaithful, or the fact that I felt like I'd been made to feel crazy. I don't know which is more devastating, but it hurt. I just don't even, there's not even a word to describe the depth of that kind of pain.
Yeah. I can't imagine. Cannot imagine. And yet a lot of people listening are like, I don't have to imagine this has been their experience. I told you offline that, my parents were divorced when I was 10. I was kind of a clueless kid. Like, I never questioned Santa Claus, Easter Bunny. I was just a oblivious kind of kid. So I think my oblivious personality weathered that pretty well. In fact, even now when I talk to my counselor, everybody's always trying to dig it up. Like, surely there's deep down trauma in your life. And I'm like, well, it wasn't great, but didn't devastate me like it did most kids. And I think even more recently, my therapist was like, kept digging. She's like, I think you're good. God blessed you with a certain kind of resilience. But I don't know really a glimpse of the pain that my parents, my mom in particular, went through. But I do have memories of like, oh, wow, that's why she was crying. Oh, that's why she was, like, seemed that way, so.
Well, what's interesting, Preston, that you say that is, all of us at different points in our life, we're going to go through really hard experiences. And even to the point where some things we go through, you might even label as trauma.
Yeah.
And I don't want to overuse that word, because sometimes I think the word trauma gets put on garden variety problems. So we don't want to maximize trauma. We definitely don't want to minimize it, though.
Right.
So regardless, your parents getting divorced, it was a trauma in your childhood. But here's the interesting part. How that trauma affects us is determined not just by what happened, but by the story we tell ourselves because of what happened. And so what I hear in your situation, not to pathologize your story, but what I hear is basically you went through that trauma, but there was a certain story you told yourself that lent your upbringing to a better processing than some other people, And so I do think we have to pay attention to not just the traumas we've been through, but the story we tell ourselves because of the trauma. And, I think the story that many people tell themselves when they're going through an unwanted divorce is, I am unwanted, unloved. There must be something wrong with me. I have to figure it out. And if I can't figure it out, then I'm going to spend the rest of my life asking questions, because I think questions will comfort me. And in the end, when someone is, like if your spouse is living a secret double life, first of all, you're not going to get the answers of everything. You're not going to know like the what, when, how, where. You're not going to have all of those answers. And if you wait to get to this place of healing because you think it's the answers that will heal you, then you could be stuck in that trauma forever. And you will be telling yourself a pretty crazy story about who you are and how you are. So I always say, there's just some things in life that will not make sense. And Jim Cress, who's one of our co-authors, has often said in our therapy sessions together, he will say, Lysa, don't try to make sense of something that makes no sense, or you will lose all sense. And so the story work that I had to do was fully acknowledging what I did know, but then working on the story that I now tell myself because of what I've walked through. That's where real progress can happen.
When you found that burner phone, did you talk to your husband, or did you?
Not at first. Not at first.
Why? Just still in like self-denial, or just not wanting to believe what you're seeing, or?
Well, because it was the weekend of my daughter's wedding. And so I took the phone, and I still didn't want to believe, that it could be the sign of infidelity. I still was holding on to this little hope. I couldn't unlock the phone at first. And so I was still holding on to this little shred of hope that I knew it was bad, but maybe it was something that, was like, maybe it was gambling. Maybe it was like, maybe he was getting some kind of substance. I don't know. And I took it over to a friend's house who's good with technology. We never could unlock the phone. And so as my daughter's rehearsal dinner was starting at my house,
Mm.
I finally handed the phone over to my ex-husband and I just said, tell me, like, I'll give you the phone back, but just tell me what's going on. And that's when he told me he'd met someone else and that he wanted to be with her. And then he finished getting dressed and walked out and greeted all of our guests. And I was laying in the couch in the fetal, like I was laying in the closet of my room, in the fetal position. And
Ugh.
I called two friends and told them what was going on, and they literally came back there. They put my clothes on me. They literally had to dress me. One took one elbow, one took the other elbow, and they walked me out and put me in the chair that I pretty much stayed in the whole night with tears just streaming down my face. I was in shock. I was just in shock.
I'm so sorry. Oh gosh, I can't imagine the pain that you felt. So that you said that was 2016. You guys tried to make it work for several years, right? What was that process like?
Well, I think there were good reasons why I tried to make it work for so long. I also think there were some unhealthy reasons too.
Hmm.
Nothing I was doing would have justified him living a double life.
Right.
But I did have some codependency happening there. And codependency is, I need you to be okay so that I can be okay. So how can I make you okay? Because I want to feel okay. Okay. And so there was some of that going on. And, when you're struggling with that, needing someone else to be okay, then you lay down your life to try to make that other person okay. And I thought I was being a good Christian wife because Jesus modeled for us to lay down our life, right? For others. That's what he did. But I think it's really important to correctly view that verse and correctly view what Jesus was exemplifying there. Jesus laid down his life to accomplish a high and holy purpose. Jesus did not lay down his life to enable bad behavior to continue. What I didn't realize is I kept thinking, the best thing for my kids is to fight for my marriage, fight for my marriage, fight for my marriage. What I didn't realize is I kept rescuing him from consequences that were his only hope of getting better. And so at some point, I literally had to say, in order to stay with someone like this, I will have to get as unhealthy as they are. And my kids deserve one healthy parent. And so it took me years. Yes. So many counseling sessions, so many second chances. Even we renewed our vows at one point. And in the end, I gave it one last year. And I just said, I'm no longer going to enable. I'm going to create enough separation here to where I'm just going to let him make his own choices. And I'm going to do it for an entire year. I'll leave room for God to move. And I'll just see what he chooses without any influence from me. And in the end, I got the clarity I needed. It was not the clarity I wanted, but it was the clarity that I needed. He had made his choice and his choice was not me.
I love seafood. It's high in protein, it's got all kinds of health benefits, and it tastes amazing. But here's the thing, I hate buying seafood. So whenever I'm at the store, I never know what I'm looking at. And I'm pretty sure some of the stuff is, dyed pretty hard to make it look all pretty. And as soon as I get home, it's like a race against the clock to eat it before it goes bad. That's why I was so excited to learn about Wild Alaskan Company. Wild Alaskan is the best way to get wild-caught, perfectly portioned, nutrient-dense seafood delivered directly to your door, and it tastes amazing. My first box was packed with sockeye salmon, coho salmon, Pacific halibut, and my favorite, Pacific cod. And you got to try that. The cod is absolutely amazing for fish tacos. The best part, it's sustainable. It's 100% wild caught. It's never farmed. And they take it right off the boat in Alaska, freeze it at peak freshness, and then send it right to your door. Not all fish are the same. Get seafood you can trust. Go to wildalaskan.com/TITR for $35 off your first box of premium wild caught seafood. Okay, so that's wildalaskan.com/TITR for $35 off your first order. Thanks to Wild Alaskan Company for sponsoring this episode. when you filed for divorce or raised a topic, I mean, was he resistant, or was he kind of like, great, or how was that process? Like, what was his response?
I don't know, Preston. I'm always careful not to, like pretend like I knew what he was
Yeah.
feeling, or I knew what he was going through. I'm not sure. Um, I just know that where I got to and the place that I got to, it was the deepest grief I've ever known. But in the end, I had to say, I'm not walking away from this marriage. I'm accepting a very painful reality.
Hmm.
And mental health is a commitment to reality at all costs. Therefore, I've got to live in reality. And reality is that the death of the marriage had already happened, you know?
Yeah.
And then I filed for divorce. I think some people want to know, like, why did I stay so long? Um, the last 10 years of my marriage, we were separated almost 5 of those years, off
Mm.
and on, off and on, off
Wow.
and on, off and on. And I think that there were honorable reasons why I stayed so long, but I also think there were pretty unhealthy reasons I stayed so long.
Hmm.
But it is what it is at this point. I can tell you that one thing Jim helped me see is I lowered my post-divorce regret down to 0.
Oh, wow.
And I don't have to live with that pain. I know I did everything I possibly could, and I did a whole lot of things I probably shouldn't have done to try to save the
Yeah.
marriage.
Are you still in relationship with your ex-husband, or no?
No.
No. Okay. Um, you're a deep thinker, very biblically centered. So I'm sure there was a lot of like, what does the Bible say about, divorce? What was the theological journey like for you? And then I want to go to Joel and do a bit of a deep dive into what the Bible says about divorce. But in your own kind of theological reflection, was that a nagging question in the back of your mind, or was it because there's infidelity? That's kind of, most people would agree, that's pretty explicitly stated that is grounds for divorce.
Yeah, I felt tortured by certain verses.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll actually let Joel tell the story of, I went through so much internal confusion and hurt. I still had people saying, don't forget, Lysa, God hates divorce. And I felt the weight not only of making a decision that was going to impact my future and my kids' future and my grandkids' future, but I also carried the weight of, I'm a woman in ministry.
Yeah.
And, I had people putting a lot of pressure on me despite the infidelity, but putting pressure on me, like, Lysa, if you do this, if you make this decision, you're going to open up Pandora's box to
Mm.
make other women think that it's okay. And there was just so much pressure and shame. And so I cried a lot and I wrestled a lot. And then I decided one day to open up to Joel about what I was going through. And Joel, I'll let you pick up the story from
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. So, Preston, I've done a lot of spent a lot of time in academia, like biblical study and theology. And I met Lysa 10 years ago. Over 10 years ago is when we actually first met.
Hmm.
I was working for a Bible software company, and we met at an event, and she began to kind of unpack like, hey, I think we really need to eradicate biblical poverty. And I, like, my ears and eyes kind of like, wait, what do you mean by biblical poverty? I think about compassion and, like, child poverty, but what do you mean by biblical poverty? And she began to describe, like, hey, people have more access to the Bible than ever before, and yet
Huh.
biblical literacy is tanking. Like, we can have more knowledge, but actually lesser understanding, which is like a wild concept. And I kind of had my Luke 24, Jesus on the road to Emmaus moment, where, like, my heart just comes alive. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the thing that I feel like the Lord has called me to. And this woman is putting words behind this, like, thing that I'm so passionate about. And so that started a journey where my wife and I, at that point, we had 3 little boys, Liam, Levi, and Luke. We're all under the age of 6 probably at that point. And we relocated from the Chicagoland area, which I did like a short 2-year stint, and moved to Charlotte, where the ministry Proverbs 31 is located. And it wasn't less than a year and a half into that that Lisa's world started to really spiral, and just devastation took place. And I was kind of invited into the conversation. We live life together. Like, we were like actual friends, Preston, like Lisa and I. My kids call her Auntie Lisa. Like, we just had a thing that happened with some kids, like with one of my kids just a couple weeks ago. And my wife and I call Lisa, for wisdom. And so I say all of that just to paint the picture of the moment. And we're sitting at our house. We do theology study days, typically at Lisa's house. And we're at this great table. And we're with another friend, Leah, who works closely with us. And Lisa was coming out. I remember she walked out, and her eyes were just bloodshot red. And she walked towards us. And at that point, you kind of, when you've had friends that have been in this kind of pain, you know that the tears stopped pouring like probably hours before. But if there were more tears, they would still be going. There just aren't any more tears left. And she sat down at the table, and she kind of like looked at me, and she just asked, she said, "Joel, is it true that God hates divorce?" And I remember, like, sometimes I have this sense like I'm supposed to have the answers. Like, I'm like, if anybody remembers the Bible Answer Man, like, you feel this pressure of being the Bible Answer Man. Like, I just remember thinking like how inept and inadequate I was for that question. And then I'm like, how in the world am I, like, I've done all the study and like and I can't remember in seminary or in my PhD work, like taking any type of detailed account at this. Like, we'll cover it in a sub, and this is where kind of this phrase kind of came out that I'm so committed to now. And that is, a theology that is unlivable is absolutely unhelpful.
Right.
And so it's like, here's a moment where there's like theological thoughts and ideas that have to intersect with real life, and they have to like, and it's like, well, how do we know that this is even biblical? Well, Jesus, this is how we know it's biblical. Like, in the incarnation, Jesus gives us a lived theology. And so we sat there and we wrestled, and I remember telling Lisa, like, hey, there's a lot of different opinions on this. And it led us to look at Malachi 2:16, which obviously opens up like a whole slew of questions of interpretation, and even just in modern Bible English translations, how they're opting to translate that verse. And so that was kind of our maybe story of how we got in there. And then we're talking another 2 to 6 years of like, that was the conversation. We're unpacking it. Lisa, I would just say, Lisa, your phraseology there is really Romans 12. It's like, if possible, so far as it depends on you, pursue peace with all people. So it's like, Lisa lived the if possible, and finally got and did all that she could, like, as it depends on her, which I think is a statement of agency that Paul gives us. Like, imagine that verse, if possible, so far as it depends on them. And you're like, whew, like, now I don't have any agency, right? and so it's like, actually, it's a gift, even though in that moment you probably feel like, this is unfair. Why does it always have to depend on me? Why am I always the one who's got to do the therapy? Why am I always the one who's got to check on the phone? Why am I always the one who's got to bear the weight of the responsibility? But when we look at it and we go, oh, Paul starts with a conditional clause. It's like, if possible, he's implying sometimes it might not be possible.
Right.
But the condition is still like, hey, like, do all that you can. And then, like, the outcome, the imperative is still peace. Like, you got to pursue peace. And sometimes peace is possible in your presence, but sometimes the only way peace is possible when it's like the relationship is not possible is to remove your presence from that situation so you can have internal peace there. And so we walked through that for the next 2 to 6 years. That's kind of the birthplace of therapy and theology. Lisa was like, by the way, in theology study days, Joel and I are having these conversations while Jim in our therapy sessions are having similar conversations. We kind of grew up in a world where therapy and theology were always supposed to be antithetical to each other, like opposed to each other. I remember the day Lisa said, Joel, would you be open to having like a lunch study session with Jim? And I was like, I don't know, Lisa. Like, I'm not trying to get into a debate with this dude. And I remember Jim walked into the door, and instantly I was just like, gosh, the humility and the wisdom, and he's got a seminary degree from Dallas Theological Seminary. The dude, he's a theologian himself. And so that was kind of the origin story of therapy and theology, but it really was at the crux of one of the most painful moments for Lysa, which sin has a compound impact. And it was no longer, it wasn't just painful for her, it was painful for all of us that obviously walked it at a varying degree. But we really had to wrestle with what the Bible actually says about divorce. What is Jesus getting at in Matthew 19? What is the culture, the context, and how do we do the hard work of like interpreting and contextualizing these verses into our modern context? And so,
Well, so Malachi 2:16, God hates divorce. That's not the only way to translate that, or the little I've dabbled in it, maybe not even the best way. There's actually a completely different translation that's possible, maybe even better, right? Can you summarize what's going on there?
Yeah, so Malachi 2:16. So it's kind of like there's these phrases that I think that live in infamy that are Christian phrases, and we just are like, oh yeah, it's the word of God, like absolutely. And I think this is one of those phrases that God hates divorce. And you look back and go, where does it come from? And most people today, if they jump to their like YouVersion app or their Bibles, and they've got NIV, ESV, CSB, they're like, wait a minute, Malachi 2:16 doesn't even say that.
Right.
So now this, like, it poses this like philosophical and like question, like, where did we even get this? Did somebody just like hijack this phrase and play the best con game ever on an entire civilization of Christians? Like, how did this happen? And it's like, well, no, actually there's a reason for this. The King James versions, the 1611, actually the updated NKJV actually says God hates divorce. And so this is going to take us into a little bit of like Bible translation world, but I think that I'm pretty confident I did this. If you take the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text of Malachi 2:16, and you handed it to a Hebrew scholar, and you said, translate this for me, I think that they're going to go, and actually this happened in real life. Hold on. let me just, and there's a reason why. There's a level of ambiguity to the text. There's words that can be taken as neutral. And so then I think what happens is the KJV and the NKJV, this is speculative on my part, I think they move from a translation decision to an interpretation decision. And at some level, I think it's an interpretation based off of a hermeneutic of fear. And so you have this phrase like God hates divorce. But if you look at the Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, it actually clarifies this a little bit more, where the subject of that hate, that Hebrew word for hate, the subject is not God. The subject is actually the husband who is unfaithful. And then when you look at like Dead Sea Scrolls, and then you're looking at rabbinic sources, it's like, wait a minute, the preferred version, the preferred translation is not God hates divorce. And I'll just read from like the CSB, verse 16 just says, if he, and the he is the husband, if he hates and divorces his wife, and then we go into a statement that God is saying, so this is God's speech, says the Lord God of Israel, and then it shifts back to he, the subject is that husband, he covers his garments with injustice, says the Lord of armies. And then right after that, therefore, so, therefore is always there for a reason, like the therefore, in light of this hatred, in light of this injustice, God's like, Yahweh's like, watch yourself carefully and don't act treacherously. And at this point, people would be like, but Joel, is this like a difference with a distinction? Like, is like, there's no, and I'd be like, no, this is a difference with the huge distinction.
It's a completely,
you're about to say something
different. It's a completely different meaning. I was just, that ESV has something very similar. Yeah. So it's almost the opposite. Yeah. It's not condemning divorce. Certainly not all divorces. It's actually addressing the husband failing to love his wife and covering. But the ESV says, you said injustice. The ESV says, where is it? Covers his garment with violence.
Violent, yeah. The Hebrew word is Hamas. There, it's yeah.
Oh right, yeah.
there's a injustice, wrongdoing, violence. It's kind of exact. But actually, I think this is fascinating. There is a militaristic background to this, and I actually go all the way back to Genesis. I think where are we in Genesis chapter 3.
Joel, while you look for that, I wanna tell you in the NIV what Malachi 2:16 says. It says, when a man hates and divorces his wife, he does violence against the one he should protect, thus says the Lord.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the violence it's directed toward the woman. In other words, and I know this can go both ways. I know sometimes it's the woman that's having the destructive patterns that are destroying the marriage. But in my situation, when we finally got to understanding a more correct version beyond just the King James version, when a man hates and divorces his wife, he does violence against the one he should protect, thus says the Lord. I mean, the relief that I felt in that moment was immense. And this was one of those moments where I thought, I don't want to write about this, but how can I not write about this when so many hurting women have had this verse weaponized against them to keep them inside of destructive marriages that do not honor the Lord,
Right.
And so, this was a huge moment for me.
Wow.
I
And
think
it's what's cool is like, you're not, some people could like want to read into the Bible what they want to see. I think it's a tendency for everybody, but here, this is a clear case where you're just you're not reading into the text that you want to be there or finding some obscure interpretation. You're just kind of seeing the original meaning of this verse for what it is. So I think that kind of relief is, admirable. Because some people I could tell, I'm like, well, I think you're just kind of trying to read this verse the way you want to. This is definitely not that case.
No, this is not that case. And again, the sources like point to that, and I want to go to that violence part because we started this conversation with just like the pain.
Yeah.
And like, Preston, you had multiple times like, gosh, I can't even imagine. Like, and I think like, of course, that pain. And so it's like that violence. I think of Genesis 2:24. This is why man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife. That Hebrew word bond, davak, it's the same word that's used of an alligator's scales. You think about like the protection. It's the same word that's used of metallurgy for like the breastplate that like protects. And so it's like, I do think that there is something that's happening here of talking about the violence of this, is that when these two that are bonded, that are merged together for the safety and protection of each other, when that's ripped apart, like, of course it's painful. It was never intended to be there. The scales of an alligator were never intended to be ripped off of it. It was intended to protect it, and so I just want to bring in like this was not God's ideal. Like there is a real devastation to this, and God in His foresight and His providence has this pattern where like he almost anticipates. He doesn't almost. He does anticipate the sinfulness of humanity, and He puts in place protection. For the least, for the vulnerable, for those in the margins of society. And Israel is like this beacon of hope, I think, in the ancient Near Eastern world of how the people of God and how humanity ought to live in light of this kind of devastation and sin.
Y'all know how much I love my dog, Tank. Oh my goodness. We go on runs together. We watch baseball games together. And every morning he sits by or on my feet while I drink my coffee. And we usually just give him dry dog food. But the other day I gave him a delicious bowl of Sundays for Dogs dog food. And I mean, he scarfed it up so fast. And then he looked at me like, dude, why have you been holding out so long? Sundays is clean and made from real meat, fruits, and veggies with no kibble. That means no weird ingredients that you can't pronounce and no fillers. And the best part is that you just scoop and serve. You don't need a freezer. There's no thawing or prep, no mess, just nutrient-rich, clean food. And I haven't tried it myself, but my dog absolutely loves it, so I know it must taste great. Right now, Sundays is running a holiday sale. Just head over to sundaysfordogs.com/TITR and get 50% off your first order, or you can use code TITR50 at checkout. Okay, that's 50% off your first order at sundaysfordogs.com/TITR, or use code TITR50 at checkout. Can we go to Matthew 19? Because that's the big one. And I love how you raise chapter 4 of the book where you ask the question, is sexual infidelity the only grounds for divorce? First of all, would you say that is the most common, popular, mainstream view? Or I know there's various views in this passage, but is that kind of like the default position, that anything other than sexual infidelity is not biblical grounds for divorce?
I would say 100% Preston. I would say that by and far that divorce as a possibility is widely accepted, right? We can start there. Like divorce is, I think there was a time where it'd be like, no reason at all. I think we've well moved beyond that.
Yeah, John Piper held that.
Right. But then we get to like Matthew 19. So then it's like the next step is like, well, then the only case for a divorce is in the question of adultery. And that obviously is pulled from Matthew 19. And Matthew 19 is somewhat more of a complex passage than, I think of Transformers. There's more than what meets the eye on this passage.
Wait, how old are you?
I'm 40. I turned 40 last week. Yeah.
More than meets the eye. Oh man, I got shades of 1987 going in my head right now.
Yeah, the cartoon was the best. I love that cartoon.
So Matthew 19, yes, he says, except for sexual immorality, porneia, I think it is, right? The Greek word.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to be like this is the one exception, but you do a great job unpacking this verse. So can you help us understand?
Okay, so I would start. Let me start with a little bit of an illustration because I think that helps. The Bible was not written void of historical, social, and cultural context. I think that that's an important thing, that we recognize that Jesus is walking around a time where words and phrases had meaning and had context. So, for instance, Lise, if I were to say, "Hey, how did the Jags do over the weekend?" What would you say?
I'd say, well, we struggled a bit playing football over in London, unfortunately. But we looked awesome when we played the Chiefs. We looked so good.
Oh yeah. Now we get into the justification and the hope of disillusioned sports team fanatics. You sound like a Cowboys fan right there. No shade. I'm just joking. Okay, so this is, I think, an example of like, hey, today you and I do a great job on culture and context. Like we understand words and phrases based off of their intended meaning. And so when I say how are the Jags doing, it's because Joel knows that Lisa's husband now, her new husband Chaz, is an incredible dude, and Chaz is himself a Jaguar football fanatic. Fantasy football, we text each other consistently about Travis Etienne and Trevor Lawrence, how the dude's playing, like the whole 9 yards. Now, what's interesting though is, Lise, how did you know when I said Jags? Like, obviously that's what I meant. I was talking about football. What were the things that were going on in your mind?
Well, just because I live near Jacksonville, and so when the minute you say Jags, I think of football because that's what I hear all the time in the cultural context that I'm in.
Now, imagine we're to say, hey, there's a massive zoo also in Jacksonville, and you got your grandkids with you, and say, Lise, how was your time with the grandkids seeing the Jags? You'd be like, oh yeah.
You don't think of animals.
Yeah, exactly. Or it'd be like, maybe you're in the car buying scenario and you're like, I've always dreamed of buying a Jaguar, like it's so all this, I'm belaboring the point, but what I'm trying to show is that today we do this, we don't even think about it, that there's a culture, and the same thing is true in the time of Jesus in Matthew 19. And if we just kind of work through the text, one, I'm convinced that Jesus, Preston, was hilarious, and I think he had a little bit of passive aggressive tendencies in the most holy and righteous ways. So like, here are the Pharisees. The Pharisees approach him. It's large crowds following him. Verse 3, some Pharisees approached him to test him. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And look at how they tried to set the trap on any grounds, right? So around the time of Jesus, there are these two primary schools of thought that have kind of come about, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And so the school of Shammai, we could just summarize it this way, that they believe that you could have a valid divorce as a matter of indecency that is found. So that indecency, however, would have had to have been connected to sexual infidelity, to adultery. Now, the school of Hillel, they were much more liberal. Like, we could think about this in terms of conservative and liberal almost, of schools of thought. And so in their kind of liberal moral understanding, they're like, any matter, that phrase is actually like for any reason. And so in the Mishnah, there's even a story of an individual, a woman who spoils her dish, like basically burns her food. It's like, there you go. you can divorce your wife for any matter. I found the reason, right? And so instantly they're trying to set a trap. And then I this is where I'm saying Jesus is a little passive aggressive and he's hilarious. I think Jesus is a great hang. Verse 4, haven't you read? I mean, he's saying this to the Pharisees, who are supposed to be the most well-read people. It's like, hey, by the way, haven't you read? And then it's really interesting that the next kind of diatribe that Jesus goes into is, you think that he might be trying to shift away from the conversation, but what he's actually doing is, a husband could be guilty of adultery only if he was sleeping with another married woman. But if he slept with an unmarried woman, technically he would not be guilty of adultery. He would be guilty of fornication, but not adultery. So in a patriarchal society, in this scenario, Jesus does a little sidestep, and what he does is he actually brings up and elevates the men to a level of responsibility that's like, by the way, you both have responsibility, both men and women, to the unity, to the origin story of what God always intended for marriage. And then verse 7, why then, he asked them, so the Pharisees, did Moses command, notice the language there, command us to give divorce papers and send her away. So this is the Pharisees putting their kind of interpretive lens on and translating the Hebrew Bible. And so Jesus responds in verse 8. He told them, well, actually, Moses permits you. So it's not a command, it's a permittance, right? And so what the Pharisees are doing is they're actually quoting from Deuteronomy 24:1,
Right.
and the Hebrew grammar there is neutral. So it could be he should or he may. And the Pharisees go with a concrete command that he must. But Jesus actually clarifies this, and then he interprets it through the lens of the gospel. And now he's saying, actually, he may, or it is allowed, but it's not necessarily demanded. And then Jesus goes on to say, well, the allowance of the divorce is based on a hardness of heart. A hardness of heart. Another very important word, because this word is connected to the Septuagint of Jeremiah 4:4, which refers to a kind of stubbornness. A kind of stubbornness. So this means that Jesus actually leaves room for divorce in the case of the offender who's showing a hardness of heart through persistent, stubborn unrepentance. And so this is where we would want to kind of clarify, we're not talking about like these one-off scenarios, like I just made a mistake. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that is unrepentant and unbecoming of the people of God. And what Jesus is ultimately saying is that this Hillel understanding of like, for any reason, you can just find a way out, that's actually inconsistent with the way of God. And then divorce in the context of adultery, this is what he says, based off of sexual immorality, is permissible, while there's also room for repentance and we should seek after it. But if it becomes necessary, it's necessary. Now, this is where I would just say, remember that the people of the time are filling in conceptual understandings of words and phrases. In the same way, when I said to Lysa, how are the Jags doing? She filled in the gap. Football, they played in London at that time. They had to try, like, there's all this stuff that's filling in. So I'm actually pulling from Dr. Instone Brewer, who's an Old Testament scholar, probably the best scholar in terms of understanding ancient certificates of divorce, and also kind of the grammar. And Instone Brewer brings up this really important point where conceptually at the time when Jesus says sexual immorality, the people of the time are filling in conceptually in their mind. And of course he means, Exodus 21, emotional neglect or material neglect or physical neglect. And so what we see as restrictive at that time would have been less about restrictive, but highlighting that one word, just like we would say the Jags, to trigger a series of other things that would have filled in the gap. And so I would just suggest that it could be interpreted that way. I would make the argument in that time that would have not been the instant way to interpret it as exclusivity.
Just to clarify, so when he says except for sexual immorality, he's not saying that this is the only exception. He's just triggering one among other grounds for divorce, rooted in like Exodus 21. Okay.
Yeah, and the reason why I think that's a valid understanding is because notice this entire conversation is already based around these two schools of thought. We're already dealing with the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. We're already dealing with what is permissible and what's not permissible. And Jesus is reframing the conversation, and he doesn't need to give every detail, right? And we're not, we don't see the recording of that, and yet we're trying to just figure out, like, how would that original hearer have heard this? And so that's where I'd say, well, yeah, they would have filled in the blanks of saying there are these categories that divorce would have been permissible.
Okay. Yeah, David Instone Brewer. Yeah, he's written a lot on this. I remember meeting him like 20 years ago. I think right when he finished his book on divorce. This is before I even knew who he was. I bumped into him at a library in England. And I remember, he said, "Oh yeah, I've just finished a book on divorce, whatever." Like, oh, tell me about that, And then later, now looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, he's written he's kind of like
extensively.
Yeah, very much so. He's a very thorough scholar. Have you come across that? I think it's an article by Wayne Grudem. It's an online article in 1 Corinthians 7. I think it's 15. Where you have that phrase, such, oh gosh, I should have this in front of me. Such things. He looks into this phrase, like divorce, and but then he uses a phrase like such things, meaning like this is one example of other things that would be destructive to the marriage. If you Googled it, Wayne Grudem, 1 Corinthians 7, divorce or something, it'd probably pop up for those listening. Really fascinating study, and he goes through a lot of research on that phrase and how that includes other things. And he's raising a question: is divorce permissible in cases of abuse?
Right.
Which most people are just gonna say, well, of course, that's what I would say, right?
Yeah.
But then you say, well, does the Bible allow for that?
Yeah.
And it does, according to Wayne Grudem, who's a very, very conservative scholar. He's not going to
exactly. And it's interesting in 1 Corinthians 7, 1-5, really, again, Paul's a good Hebrew kid, right? Like he's a good Hebrew boy. He understands his Old Testament. And so Paul is dealing with kind of that emotional obligation that's included in divorce, right? And then when he's writing in 1 Corinthians 3, and elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, he's dealing with the material obligations that brings a connection back to Exodus 21 of like this understanding of the permissibility of divorce being possible in the context of emotional neglect, material neglect, and physical neglect. And so some people might be like, well, what are those things? Like material neglect would have been like withholding food, clothing, or shelter. Emotional neglect would be conjugal rights. That rabbis, I think, also had in mind a type of cruelty and humiliation that this kind of encompassed as well. And then physical neglect, unfaithfulness, adultery, and physical abuse. And so while the rabbis had in mind a way to restore, if possible, the certificate of divorce that was granted to the woman, this is again one of the things that Brewer brings up, that the certificate of divorce was an unknown piece of paper, parchment, in the ancient Near Eastern world amongst all the other nations of the world. So I didn't
know that. Yeah, you said that in the book. I was fascinated.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? And again, it points to the heart of God, that God had kind of puts the safety net in place for women. And why this isn't important is because with the certificate of divorce, one, they could remarry, but then also secondarily, they get the dowry or the ketubah. They get that back from the husband. So there's some financial stability that's connected there as well. And so I just think that in the New Testament, when Jesus is talking in Matthew 19, he's not drawing from an ambiguous place. They're having a conversation, and the common playground of that conversation is Exodus 21. It's Deuteronomy 24. It's these places that the rabbis have already been trying to, or the Pharisees and Sadducees actually have already been trying to determine, and they've split into two camps on what the possibility is.
Yeah. The verse I was looking for, it is 1 Corinthians 7:15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. And it's that phrase, in such cases, meaning this case and other things kind of like this. And again, Grudem went to a big background study on what those other cases might look like. I know we're coming close to the hour here. I want to bring it back to Lysa. I'm really curious how your divorce has affected either your ministry and or have you gotten like flack from other Christians or believers, criticism, shame? What's the post-divorce life been like for you?
It's such a good question. Preston, how has it impacted the ministry? Well, unfortunately, there are so many women going through this.
Mm-hmm.
And because they know that I understand the depth of the pain, I've become a safe person for them to turn to. And I think because Jim and Joel and I have shown over and over and over and over how important correct theology is, I think we've become not only a safe place, but a trusted place. And so this is not the area of my ministry that I wanted to grow. But I would say this is actually the fastest growing part of our ministry. And I don't believe it's because in any way, shape, or form, I have inadvertently given women permission to divorce. I don't think that. I think that women were looking for a safe place that they could trust from a theological standpoint to finally raise their hand and say, I'm in this situation and I need help. And I'm grateful that we have the help that can get them started on their journey. And of course, we always say, we're not going to tell you what to think. I'm not out there telling women, get a divorce. I'm not encouraging that. Neither is Joel and neither is Jim. We're not going to tell you what to think. We're just going to give you a lot to think about. And I want to provide these women with the emotional fortitude and the biblical confidence to be able to process this through the lens of truth. And I think that's really important. And then the second part of your question, have I gotten a lot of pushback? I think that there probably are conversations being had where people, don't particularly like the fact that I've gotten a divorce. But honestly, Preston, I think I've been shielded from those. I've been so grateful. I think people saw how long and how hard that I fought for my marriage. I think my story has become more obvious as time has gone on. And I think people know, like, if there was anything else that could have been done, I would have done it even. And like I said, there were good reasons for that and unhealthy reasons for that. So did I have people at the beginning of the journey saying really cruel things to me? Absolutely. But have a lot of those people retracted their statement? 100%.
Oh, really?
And yeah. And I think even if they haven't retracted it, I think the way they treat me now retracts their original view of, how detrimental it would be for me to get a divorce. I think the story, sometimes time brings clarity because, it's not that I'm revealing more details. It's just that a clear picture has been formed by kind of looking at what's played out over time. And, I think people can see that I wasn't in a rush to get into another relationship. It was years before I would even date. And so I think that helped build a little more trust into the decision I made, and that, it was the right decision. So, but thank you for asking that question.
That's, I know there's a lot of, there's a lot of shame in the church surrounding many different things, unfortunately, and divorce can be one of those. So thank you both again for being on Theology Ron. Thank you for writing this really helpful book. Again, it's Surviving an Unwanted Divorce, a biblical practical guide to letting go while holding yourself together. I mean, just to say it again, my favorite thing about this book is it's not just a testimony. Those are great. Those are amazing. But when you're dealing with something that is theologically sensitive, I so appreciate as a theologian, obviously, the fact that you did ask the hard questions and didn't just say, this is the horrible experience I went through, it is terrible, blah, 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 which, again, there's a place for those books, but I just love that you wove in a theology of marriage, theology of divorce, answered hard questions. So thank you both again for the book, and thanks for being on Theology Ron.
Thanks, Preston.
Thank you.